First of all, I want to say something about the modern crisis, then something about existentialism and the modern crisis, and then something about Sartre and the crisis in morality. Finally, there will be a conclusion. Now, to begin with the modern crisis, I have examined a crisis in religion and philosophy, about which I want to be very brief at this time, and I still have to examine what I take to be a crisis in morality. And in all three instances, there is one common factor which consists in the enormous rise of the natural sciences and in their wake of the social sciences too. I do believe that this great development of the sciences has an enormous amount to do with what I have called the modern crisis. This does not mean to anticipate that I think that this development of the sciences is regrettable. That doesn't follow at all. I just see a connection there. Now, the way that I conceive of the modern crisis in religion, as many of you by now know, is that science has threatened traditional, naive beliefs, that science has made it impossible for large masses of thoughtful, educated, intelligent people to hold the same kind of beliefs in the same way in which their parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, and generations for hundreds of years have held them, and has led to a widespread abandonment of these beliefs or to an attempt at reinterpretation. And in the wake of this reinterpretation, there is the very serious question in many instances, what meaning remains to these beliefs? I have further tried to point out in the first lecture that morally, this ties in with tonight's problem, that morally there has come to be a very open, a frequently, frankly avowed process of selection where people admit that they don't accept all the moral commandments of their religion, but that they pick out some while rejecting others as, of course, primitive or, of course, to be accounted for in historical terms or perhaps in psychological terms. And in the wake of this selection, the question arises whether then the morality isn't really based on reason, on experience, on conscience, and whether bringing in religion or God afterwards as a sanction is not merely redundant. There's the further problem I have suggested in the first lecture, that organized religion has always posed for true religion, a point that Kierkegaard made at particular length and with great emphasis, but a point that one could easily trace back through the history of religion at the very least as far as the biblical prophets. And there's also an inverse proportion of the quantity of believers and the quality of believers, a point again abundantly made in the Hebrew scriptures, that in times in which everybody flocks to the temple, religion is likely to become something shallow and superficial, while it is perhaps only the remnant, perhaps only the small number that has religion in a deeper sense. The crisis in philosophy, I have suggested last week, consists in the fact that emulation of the natural sciences leads more and more and more English-speaking philosophers to reject almost all, not quite all, but almost all of traditional philosophy. One begins to wonder whether traditional philosophic tenets are not perhaps just as untenable as traditional religious beliefs. Some of them seem to have to be accounted for, again, either in psychological or more often in historical terms as belonging to a certain era, but many of them no longer seem at all acceptable. This, I think, is a crisis, even if some people would call it by another name. The large body of philosophy that has come down to us has suddenly become questionable. People wonder whether what has been called philosophy hitherto is worth preserving. And what some of them are now doing is something quite different from what was done traditionally, and as far as English-speaking philosophers are concerned, tends on the whole to be very academic and to be of relatively little interest to the very large number, to the steadily growing number of intelligent and concerned laymen in the sense that they are not professional philosophers. There's further the factor that in philosophy too, organization plays some part, that more and more philosophers find themselves allied with universities. In fact, practically all of them. There are hardly any philosophers left who do not have some university position, and being in the academies, they tend to be more academic. There's a rising number of philosophic journals which are read by fellow craftsmen, so one tends to write for each other, for other professional philosophers, for fellow technicians, instead of dealing with cosmic questions, with religious questions, with the larger moral questions. You might say, even so, where is the crisis? And perhaps I have to add only one thing at this particular point, and that is what creates such a crisis here is that for all the emulation of the sciences, so far, except possibly in such narrow fields as probability theory or something of that sort, certainly philosophers, for all their academic manners, haven't come up with any results comparable to those of the natural sciences. And where is the crisis in morality? The crisis in morality, I think, parallels the crises that I have tried to analyze in religion and in philosophy. Here, too, it is very largely due to the development of science. And again, I'm not at all critical of science for this. I don't hold it against science. On the contrary, I heartily appreciate the, on the whole, anti-authoritarian attitudes that science breeds. In science, there are no authorities. In science, you can always be challenged for the evidence. You can't just say a great man said. You can't cite Newton as an authority. You have to see whether things stand up. Moreover, you have to consider alternative hypotheses. Sometimes there is a seemingly very good hypothesis, but you still have to ask, aren't there some other hypotheses that are just as good? And perhaps one of these alternatives is even more elegant than the one you already have. In this way, traditional morality is undermined. Once one gets into the habit of asking what's the evidence for what is being said, and aren't there any alternatives, you have an attitude that no longer acquiesces in traditional morality. Traditional morality need not even be exactly the same for everybody. It may differ slightly in some respects, depending on ethnic or on religious background. But what moralities in general have in common, traditional moralities, is that they have something authoritarian to them, that they are originally taught to a child as what's what. The parent knows, the teacher knows, the rabbi, priest, or minister knows, and the child is supposed to accept what it is told. And when one gets into the mood of saying, well, what's the evidence for this, and aren't there perhaps alternatives, traditional morality is undermined. And the obvious result that this has led to can be summed up in one word, namely relativism, moral relativism, where people ask whether whatever morality they have been brought up on isn't possibly just one morality among a large number of moralities, and is there really any reason, they ask, for preferring one to the others. The social sciences have developed further, and again they have had a very critical influence on morality. Here perhaps the best single example would be the kind of thing that is exemplified by the Kinsey reports, by gathering statistics, by telling people what percentage of the population does certain things. People's conscience becomes a little less stern, they have the feeling that there is some safety, at any rate in numbers, that if so many people do such things, they can't be quite so bad. Of course, it would be foolish to suppose that science is the only factor in this crisis in morality. It obviously isn't. There are other factors. For instance, that there are such growing numbers of people, more people than ever before. Well, with a growing number of people, there's also a growing anonymity. There's a loosening of social bonds. There's mobility. More people move around. They move from the country to a city, from a small city to a very big city, from one big city to another city. And as a result of this, there is a loosening of social bonds. Nobody knows you. The neighbors no longer know you. And here, too, certain restrictions fall by the way. And there is necessarily, as a result of this, as there always, I think, has been in history, under comparable circumstances, a growing permissiveness. And all this that I have said so far, I don't mean to take sides. I don't mean to make any particular evaluation. I just want to explain what I mean by the crisis in morality. Perhaps it is relevant and even crucially important to say something about the word crisis at this point. After all, a crisis is not necessarily anything bad anyway. What crisis means, literally, is a turning point, a crucial time. The Greek word krinein means to separate, and you might say that a crisis is the time which separates the men from the boys. It is somehow a decisive moment. Krinein means not only separate but also decide. Crisis is the moment of decision, or to use a term that is used in a certain sport, it's the moment of truth. The moment when you sort of see what stands up and what doesn't stand up. It's in that spirit that I speak of crisis, not in a nostalgic way, not by way of suggesting, aren't we an unfortunate generation, that ours is a time of crisis, but I want to leave wide open whether every time isn't possibly a time of crisis, and whether if in some respects our crises are more acute than ever, I want to leave open whether that is a good or a bad thing. Now, one trouble with these lectures, I think, has been that in the last lecture, although I did speak of Nietzsche, I did not, on the whole, concentrate on existentialism, but I illustrated the crisis in philosophy very largely from English-speaking philosophy. And so I, after having in these general terms characterized the modern crisis, want next to deal with existentialism and the modern crisis. And here, at least in the beginning, I can again fall back on some points previously made. I'll first deal very briefly with the two men to whom I have already devoted a lecture apiece, namely Kierkegaard and Nietzsche. One thing that they have in common, in spite of the many things that very obviously they don't have in common, is that both of them were aware of the kind of crisis that I have tried to picture for you. I don't at all go along with the attempt made by some people of kind of throwing Kierkegaard and Nietzsche together as if all their many differences were unimportant. It does seem to me that very obviously their differences are in reality more important than the things that they have in common. They're more important because they differed on the things that mattered most to them. Nothing mattered more to Kierkegaard than how one might become a true Christian, and probably few things mattered more to Nietzsche than his criticism of Christianity, not just of Christendom, but of Christianity. But for all that, they do have some things in common, and one thing they have in common is that in the middle of the 19th century, or one man in the middle and one man a little later, still in the 19th century, they foresaw a crisis that many people even today are not fully aware of.